The night started like any other at Murphy's bar, until the roar of outlaw bikes shattered the quiet. When one of them laid hands on Hannah Cross, the whole room froze, too afraid to act. But Hannah didn't beg, and she didn't break. She stood tall, demanding only respect. What came next turned a small-town bar into a battlefield as her 3 military brothers arrived, moving with precision no outlaw could match. By morning, the gang was gone, and the Cross name carried a new weight. Would you have stood in silence or in defiance? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The neon light outside flickered in dull pink and green, its hum mixing with the faint static of an old jukebox that hadn't been touched since early evening. Inside Murphy's bar, the stools sat mostly empty, a couple of regulars hunched over their beers, and the clock above the shelves ticked closer to midnight. Hannah Cross moved with the kind of steady rhythm that came from years of long shifts, her rag tracing slow circles on the polished wood counter, her other hand stacking clean glasses with quiet precision. She wasn't one to rush. Even at last call, her pace was measured, her eyes always sweeping the room, noting every detail. That was the kind of awareness she carried into every corner of her life. The bar smelled faintly of spilled whiskey and lemon polish, the scents embedded into the walls from decades of nights like this. The old ceiling fan clicked lazily overhead, fighting a battle with stale smoke that still clung to the rafters from an earlier crowd. Murphy's wasn't the kind of place that drew excitement. It was a local refuge, a steady landmark at the edge of town where truckers, mill workers, and tired men came to sit in silence. Hannah had grown up watching the place change hands, and now, at 28, she held the bar steady as though it were an extension of her own spine. She leaned on the counter for a moment, wiping her hands on the apron tied around her waist, listening to the muffled laughter of 2 old men in the back booth. One of them, Frank, had been coming here since her father's day. He raised his glass in her direction, a silent acknowledgement, and she nodded back. Hannah didn't talk much unless she had to. Her presence carried in other ways, how she remembered each man's drink, how she kept order with just a glance, how she made this rundown place feel like a shield against the outside world. Outside, the night stretched quiet, the Tulane road nearly empty. Headlights had grown scarce since the factory closed down years ago, and the town had taken on the slow, weary rhythm of survival. Hannah didn't mind the silence. She thrived in it. The bar was hers to hold together, at least for these last hours of the night. She set a fresh pot of coffee on the burner, knowing one of the regulars would ask for it before heading home. Her reflection stared back faintly from a mirror behind the liquor bottles. Dark hair tied back, eyes steady, expression unreadable. Some customers called her cold. Others said she was the only reason the place hadn't shut down. She ignored both and kept working, one glass at a time. The neon sign buzzed again, louder this time, and for a moment she thought about how quickly quiet nights could change. Trouble had a way of showing up when you least expected it. Slipping through doors meant only for familiar faces. She brushed the thought away and poured the last drink of the night for Frank, sliding it down the counter with practiced ease. "Closing soon," she said softly, more ritual than warning. Frank raised his glass again in answer, and the bar settled into a hush that felt almost sacred. Hannah wiped the counter one last time, listening to the steady hum of the neon, steady as her heartbeat. The night was almost over, but something in the air whispered it wouldn't stay quiet for long. The hum of the neon outside shifted under the sudden weight of sound, a low vibration at first, then a growing thunder that made the windows rattle in their frames. The regulars lifted their heads from their beers, expressions tightening, and Frank muttered something under his breath that nobody caught. Hannah straightened from the counter, rag still in her hand, her eyes narrowing toward the door. The engines didn't sound like a passing convoy or the occasional trucker heading down the highway. This was deliberate, a chorus of throttles held open, a declaration of arrival meant to be heard by everyone within miles. The roar built until it seemed to fill the entire block. Neon glass shook. Bottles clinked against each other on the shelves. Then the sound cut abruptly as kickstands hit the pavement outside, metal striking asphalt like hammer blows. Silence followed for the briefest of moments, heavy and waiting. Hannah's steady hands didn't move, but inside her chest a small knot tightened. This wasn't the usual end-of-night crowd drifting in for one last beer. This was something else. The door creaked open before anyone inside could say a word. Cold night air swept in, carried with the faint smell of gasoline, oil, and leather. Shadows filled the doorway first, broad figures outlined against the glow of headlamps still burning outside. Then boots crossed the threshold, heavy and deliberate. The first man through was tall, his leather cut marked with patches that spoke of rank in ways outsiders rarely understood. His beard was gray at the edges, his eyes sharp and restless, scanning the bar with practiced confidence. Behind him came three more, followed by the sound of others lingering just outside. The regulars stiffened, some turning their shoulders inward, pretending to study their drinks, while others leaned back in their chairs as if distance could disguise unease. Hannah watched without flinching, though she could feel the ripple of tension running through the room like static before a storm. She'd grown up in this town, seen bikers pass through before, but never this crew. These men didn't walk like travelers looking for a hot meal. They moved like they owned whatever ground they stood on. One of them chuckled under his breath as his boot scraped across the floor, the sound loud in the hush. "Quiet little place," he said, his voice gravelly, directed at no one in particular but carrying like a challenge. Another man slapped a bill on the counter, grinning wide enough to show the gap between his teeth. "Whiskey," he ordered, as if testing how much authority he could press into a single word. Hannah set the rag aside and reached for a bottle, her movements as calm as they had been all night. She poured without comment, sliding the glass across the counter. Her silence made the moment heavier, the kind of quiet that dared someone to push harder just to see if they could break it. Outside, the engines ticked as they cooled, filling the night with sharp metallic pings that echoed in the stillness of the street. Inside, the bar no longer felt like the quiet refuge it had been minutes earlier. Every man in the room knew something had shifted, and the shadows from the highway had finally stepped inside. The men spread out as if they'd done this 100 times before, boots dragging against the worn floorboards, leather creaking with every shift of their shoulders. Their patches caught the neon glow, fragments of skulls and flames stitched in colors that seemed meant to unsettle. The air inside the bar thickened, carrying with it the smell of exhaust still clinging to their jackets. For a moment, no one spoke. It was only the scrape of chairs being pulled back and the clink of glass against the counter that filled the silence. Hannah stood behind the bar as though nothing had changed. Her hand reached for the whiskey bottle with steady precision, her fingers wrapping around the neck without a tremor. She poured into waiting glasses, the golden liquid catching the low light, rising almost a brim before she slid each drink forward. "Whiskey," she said softly, her voice even, stripped of challenge or fear, just as it had been for years of tending this counter. That tone, quiet, unshaken, had carried her through drunks, arguments, and men twice her size trying to prove themselves. It was a tone that didn't rise, but somehow carried weight. The first outlaw leaned in, his elbows pressing into the bar's edge. His grin showed more malice than humor. "Ain't often we get served by a lady who don't shake when we walk in." His words hung heavy, testing, waiting for her to break her rhythm. Hannah only lifted another glass, filled it, and set it down with the same controlled motion. Her gaze met his just long enough to acknowledge him, then moved to the next man as if the comment hadn't mattered. Frank shifted in his booth at the back, muttering something into his glass. Another regular coughed, the sound sharp in the tense air, as though he wanted to remind himself he still had a voice. But neither of them stood, neither of them tried to intervene. Everyone knew what could happen when outsiders like these came looking for attention. The safest place was silence, letting the storm pass. Hannah's eyes swept the room once more, not hurried, not darting, just steady. She had learned that kind of control long ago, in a house where her older brothers had drilled discipline into every movement. Keep your breathing even. Don't let them see your hands shake. Stand your ground by simply not moving. That training had settled into her bones, and now, in this bar, it showed itself in the smallest ways. The way she set down each glass, the way she refused to step back even as the outlaws leaned closer. The man with the gap in his teeth knocked back his shot in one swallow and slammed the glass on the counter, harder than necessary. "Pour me another, sweetheart." His tone carried the challenge that his grin confirmed. Hannah didn't flinch. She filled it again, the bottle tilting smoothly, her voice low but firm when she replied, "You'll pay for what you drink." Not a joke, not an apology, just fact. Laughter broke from one of the men near the jukebox, sharp and hollow. It rang across the room, cutting through the stillness. Another outlaw muttered something crude under his breath, but even then, Hannah's face didn't change. She didn't offer smiles, didn't play the role they expected. She gave them whiskey and the calm weight of a gaze that didn't back down. That, more than anything, unsettled them. The unease grew thicker with every second. The regulars could feel it pressing down, and the bikers, though loud and brash, found themselves leaning into a silence they hadn't created. Hannah's calm was disarming, her steady gaze reminding them that this was her ground, her counter, her bar. The night had shifted when they walked in, but she wasn't about to let them believe they had taken it from her. Not yet. The whiskey hit their tongues and loosened whatever restraint they had walked in with. The first outlaw, broad-shouldered with a scar cutting across his jaw, leaned back on a stool and let out a laugh that echoed off the low ceiling. "This whole town looks like it's been asleep for 20 years, he said, slapping the counter with a callous hand. "Surprised the lights even work in here." His words were met with a ripple of laughter from the men gathered near the jukebox, the sound rough and mocking, loud enough for everyone in the room to know the bar now belonged to their noise. Another man pulled a roll of bills from his pocket, peeling off a few with exaggerated slowness before tossing them across the counter. They scattered across the wood like discarded scraps, not placed with throne, as though money itself could carry contempt. "Keep the bottle," he said, grinning with teeth stained by smoke and years of cheap liquor. "Might as well drink in style, since we're stuck in this backwater." Hannah gathered the bills with the same calm she'd shown all night, stacking them neatly, her fingers moving without hesitation. She didn't thank him, didn't smile, only set the bottle back on the bar with measured precision. Her silence felt heavier than words, but the outlaws weren't the kind to notice weight unless it landed as a fist. "You folks even know what a real ride looks like out here?" One of them shouted toward the booths where the regular Saturday, but the fastest thing in this town's a rusted pickup with 2 bald tires. The men at the back kept their eyes low, pretending their drinks required full attention. No one answered. That was a way of survival. Let the outsiders burn themselves out. Don't give them fuel. But the outlaws weren't content with silence. They wanted reaction. Another tossed a crumpled dollar at Hannah's feet, the bill fluttering to the floor by her boots. "Pick that up for me, darling," he said, leaning forward, his voice thick with challenge. The others laughed, one of them pounding the counter with his fist as if to punctuate the insult. Hannah looked down at the bill, then back up at the man. Her face didn't change, her eyes steady as stone. She reached instead for a clean glass, filled it with whiskey, and set it down in front of him without a word. The dollar remained where it had fallen, ignored. For a moment, the laughter stuttered, confused by her refusal to play into their game. Scarred Jaw smirked and shook his head. "Got yourself a stubborn one," he said to his crew. "Not bad for a town this dead. Maybe it's the only thing around here that's still got a little fire." His words dripped with insinuation, drawing more laughter, rough and ugly. The tension thickened with every joke, every toss bill, every glance that lingered too long. The locals sat frozen in their booths, wishing themselves invisible, while the outlaws pushed harder, circling the edge of something darker. Hannah wiped the counter again, her movements deliberate, her silence defiant. She had seen storms like this before, and she could feel the air shifting. Trouble wasn't on its way. It was already here, and it was only waiting for one careless moment to break wide open. The laughter swelled until it pressed against the walls, an ugly chorus that seemed to drown out the hum of the neon and the faint tick of the ceiling fan. Chairs scraped, glasses thudded onto wood, and boots shifted restlessly on the floorboards. It was all noise and mockery until one of them, broad, heavy-set, his vest covered in patches like battle trophies, decided words weren't enough anymore. He pushed off his stool with a slow swagger, the kind that announced itself before he even reached the counter. His boots landed hard. Each step meant to echo. Hannah was wiping down the bar again, her hands steady as ever, her gaze calm. She had seen this kind of posture before. Men who needed the room to know they were in control, men who confused intimidation with respect. She didn't flinch as he came closer, didn't step back when a shadow fell over her. The others leaned in, grins wide, waiting. Then his hand shot out. Thick fingers closed around her waist, pulling her forward with sudden force. The rag slipped from her hand and dropped to the floor. The bar froze. The jukebox, though silent, seemed louder than ever, its dust-coated lights glowing faintly in the corner. No one moved, no one breathed. The outlaw's grip was rough, pressing into the fabric of her apron. He leaned in close, his breath carrying the stench of whiskey and smoke. "Told you you'd fire," he growled, loud enough for the others to hear. His crew erupted in jeers and laughter, pounding fists on tables, slapping each other on the back as though this were sport, a game played in a town too small to fight back. Hannah didn't fight against his hand. Not yet. She stood still, her spine straight, her chin lifted slightly so her eyes met his. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but edged like steel. "Take your hand off me." No tremor, no plea, just a command. The laughter faltered for a beat, the silence sharp enough to cut through the room. The outlaw sneered, his grip tightening. "Or what?" he taunted, his grin wide and menacing. His companions chuckled again, but softer now, unsure the quiet in the bar was settling on their side or hers. In the booths, Frank's hands gripped the edge of the table, so hard his knuckles turned white. Another regular muttered a curse, but kept his head down, eyes on the amber swirl in his glass. Everyone knew the balance had shifted. A line had been crossed, and the night would not return to what had been only minutes earlier. Hannah's eyes never left his. Her silence pressed harder than his grip, her defiance speaking louder than the outlaw's noise. The bar held its breath. Outside, the cooling engines ticked faintly in the night air, a reminder that more waited beyond the door. For one long, unbroken moment, it was as though the entire town was watching through the cracked windows and neon glow, waiting to see if the storm would break here and now. The outlaw's hand remained firm on her waist, but the stillness in her gaze, the cold fire in her voice, made the room understand. Something heavier than whiskey and money had just been set on the table. The outlaw's hand clamped around Hannah's waist like a vice, and the bar seemed to stop breathing. The laughter that followed his grab died too quickly, as if even his companions knew they had gone a step too far, but didn't want to be the first to show doubt. The only sounds left were the faint buzz of the neon sign outside and the lazy tick of the ceiling fan overhead, its blades slicing the silence in uneven rhythm. The regulars sat frozen in their seats, their bodies stiff with the weight of knowing. Frank's eyes dropped to the swirl of whiskey in his glass, staring into it as though it might offer escape. The man across from him tapped a finger nervously against the table, each dull thud matching the beat of his pulse. No one stood. No one spoke. They all understood exactly who these men were, or at least the type. Stories travel faster than freight trains in towns like this. Stories of outlaws who left broken teeth and wrecked lives in their wake. Men like that didn't come for a drink. They came to remind the world that they couldn't be denied. Silence thickened, but it wasn't cowardice alone that held the locals in their seats. It was survival, a ritual etched deep into small-town instinct. When trouble walked in wearing leather and patches, you learned to look away. Eyes on the counter, hands on your glass. Don't invite attention. Don't give them a reason. It wasn't loyalty to Hannah that kept them still, but a calculation that one wrong move might turn a bad night into a funeral. Hannah felt the hush pressing around her like another set of hands. She could feel every pair of eyes flicker toward her and then away, each glance a confession of their helplessness. The outlaw's fingers dug deeper into her side, but her posture didn't break. Her chin remained lifted, her voice still echoing in the quiet air. "Take your hand off me." The words had hung there, unanswered, and now they carried more weight than anything else in the room. The man laughed under his breath, a sound that rasped through the stillness like gravel, sliding down a slope. "Nobody here's going to help you," he said, twisting his mouth into a grin. He wasn't just talking to her. He was speaking to the whole bar, daring someone to deny it. No one moved. Frank reached for his glass with trembling fingers and drained the last of his whiskey, the sound of ice clinking marking his surrender to silence. The outlaw's crew chuckled, but it was thinner than before, a laugh forced into the air to cover unease. They knew what silence like this meant. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't resistance either. It was the crowd turning into witnesses, recording everything in their stillness. That quiet carried judgment. It turned every man in that room into part of the story, whether they wanted it or not. Outside, the night pressed its face to the windows, the glow of motorcycles still burning against the dark. Inside, the bar was a hell breath. Hannah's eyes stayed locked on the man's, unblinking, steady. If no one else would speak, her silence was enough. It wasn't surrender. It was promise, cold and unshaken, that this moment would not pass without consequence. The locals might freeze, but the weight of their witness lingered heavy in the air, as undeniable as the outlaw's hand to her waist. The outlaw's grip tightened, his thick fingers pressing hard against the fabric of Hannah's apron, pulling her closer to him as though the entire bar existed only to watch his claim. His grin widened, crooked teeth glinting under the soft light, and for a moment he looked like a man who had already won. But Hannah's body went still, stiffening not with fear, but with the deliberate resistance of someone who refused to give ground. She didn't thrash, didn't claw at his hand, didn't beg him to release her. She stood rooted, her shoulders square, her eyes cutting into his with sharpness that froze the moment even deeper than the silence had. Her voice came low, deliberate, and cold enough to carry a chill through the smoky air. "Take your hand off me." There was no waver, no rise of panic, no hint that she expected anyone to ride in and save her. The words were stripped bare of everything but command, and they landed heavy enough to still even the chuckles of his crew. For a long beat, he blinked, almost surprised. He had expected pleading, maybe anger laced with fear, the reaction that gave men like him the satisfaction they craved. What he got instead was defiance that held steady like iron. He squeezed again, harder this time, his grin faltering into a sneer. "You think you could tell me what to do?" His voice cracked to quiet, trying to reclaim ground that her tone had stolen. Around the room, the regulars stayed frozen, eyes fixed on the floorboards, their stillness turning into a kind of shame. They heard her voice, sharp as a blade, and knew they should rise, knew that letting her stand alone marked them as complicit. But no one moved. They'd seen what happened in other towns when men tried to stand against leather and steel. It wasn't fear for themselves that pinned them in place. It was the weight of knowing what violence could turn into if sparked. Hannah didn't look to them. She didn't expect anything from men who had already averted their eyes. Her fight was hers alone, and her gaze never left the outlaws. He leaned closer, the stink of his breath flooding the space between them, his lips curling into a snarl. "Say it again," he growled, daring her, testing the edges of her calm. She did not hesitate. "Take your hand off me." Each word sharp, clipped, pressed into the air with the weight of steel doors closing. It was the tone of someone who had been raised alongside discipline, someone who had watched her brothers drill commands into their bones until silence obeyed. Her voice carried that same gravity now, a thread of the soldier's world woven into the quiet frame of a bartender. The outlaw's jaw twitched, and for the first time the laughter around him faltered. His crew shifted, glancing between her and their leader, uncertain if the fun had just cracked into something heavier. The bar felt smaller, the air taut with the question of what would happen next. But Hannah didn't blink, didn't soften, didn't give anything. Her defiance wasn't loud or wild. It was cold, steady, and immovable. In that moment, the outlaw might have had his hand on her waist, but everyone in the room knew whose grip truly held power. It was not his. It was hers. The silence cracked in the sound of laughter, rough and jagged, as though the outlaws had been holding it back and now released it in one jagged wave. It started with a bark from a man who still had his hand on Hannah's waist, then spread to the others, a chorus of jeers that filled every inch of Murphy's bar. Boots stomped against the floor, fists pounded against the counter, and the sound of their mockery reverberated until it drowned out the hum of the neon sign outside. "Brave for a barmaid," their leader said, his voice rising above the rest. He stood near the door, tall and broad, his leather vest heavy with patches that spoke of rank. His words carried the rhythm of someone used to speaking for others, used to his voice setting the tone for a room. He leaned back slightly, his grin sharp, and repeated it louder. "Brave for a barmaid." Look at her, doesn't even flinch. The men around him howled, slapping each other's backs, their faces twisted with amusement. One leaned on the jukebox, shaking his head as if in disbelief, while another tossed a crumpled bill onto the floor just for the spectacle of it. They weren't laughing because they found her funny. They were laughing because they needed to prove to themselves that her defiance was nothing. Turning her into a joke made her less dangerous, at least in their eyes. Hannah stood still, the outlaw's hand still clamped at her waist, her jaw tight but her gaze unwavering. She didn't give them what they wanted. She didn't look away. She didn't shrink. Her silence was louder than their laughter, and though they tried to drown her with noise, that calm defiance spread its own weight across the bar. The regulars felt it too. Frank's hand shook slightly as he reached for his empty glass, and the man beside him clenched his jaw, but neither dared to stand. They sat trapped between the roar of the outlaws and the quiet strength of the bartender, who refused to bend. "Careful, boys," another outlaw shouted, his words slurred from whiskey but dripping with malice. "This one might bite." More laughter followed, loud and guttural, rolling through the bar like a storm. Yet even in their noise there was something brittle, as though they laughed too hard, too long, because they couldn't quite erase the edge in her voice when she'd spoken. The leader's grin widened as he stepped closer, his boots clicking against the wood. He studied her with narrowed eyes, as though trying to measure whether her calm was real or just a mask. "I'll give you this," he said, voice carrying through the noise. "Takes guts to stare a man in the eye when you're alone. Brave for a barmaid. Brave, but stupid." His crew roared again, the sound filling every corner until even the bottles on the shelves seemed to hum with it. Hannah's lips parted just slightly, not in fear, but in breath she measured carefully, keeping it steady, deliberate. She had grown up learning how to hold her ground when her brothers tested her, and though none of them were here now, their lessons lived in her posture. She didn't break. She didn't tremble. The laughter echoed, but for all its volume, it couldn't cover the truth pressing through the room, that she had not given in, and that her silence carried more weight than their jeers could smother. The spectacle belonged to them, but the power in that moment, quiet and unyielding, remained hers. The laughter rattled on, coarse and jagged, filling the bar with the kind of sound that made the walls seem thinner and the night outside seem farther away. The outlaws pounded their fists on the counter, their boots stomping the floor like they were trying to shake the place down to its foundation. Hannah remained stiff under the outlaws' grip, her voice and her stillness echoing louder than their noise, but the air was shifting. Everyone inside knew it couldn't hold this way forever. At a small table near the far wall, a man who hadn't said a word all night slowly pushed back his chair. His hair was white, cut close to the scalp, his back bent with years, his jacket frayed at the cuffs. He had been a fixture in the bar for as long as most would remember, always alone, always quiet. Folks called him Sarge, though few still knew his real name. He didn't draw attention to himself now. He moved with the kind of patience that only age or discipline could teach, as though each motion had been thought through twice before it was made. The bikers were too busy jeering at Hannah to notice him shuffle toward the door. The neon glow spilled in around his frame as he slipped outside, the night air swallowing him up. The cool darkness was a relief after the stifling noise inside. He paused on the sidewalk, listening to the idle tick of motorcycle engines cooling in the lot. He glanced back once through the window, saw Hannah's still figure at the counter, and set his jaw. From his coat pocket, he pulled an old flip phone, the kind that had outlasted more modern screens. His thumb pressed a button worn smooth from years of use, and he brought it to his ear. His voice, when it came, was low but steady. "It's happening," he said, no greeting, no wasted words. "Murphy's. Now." He didn't wait for questions. He didn't need to explain. The weight of his tone carried everything that mattered. The call was short, less than 10 seconds, but its reach was longer than the outlaws inside could ever imagine. Across town, in houses where lights had already gone dim, in apartments where boots still sat by the door, the words traveled. Men stirred from their chairs, lifted keys from hooks, pulled jackets over their shoulders. Some were older, marked by time, others younger but tempered by the same bloodline of service. They were Hannah's brothers in more than one way. tied to her not by birth, but by the shared language of discipline, of steel, of never leaving someone to stand alone. Sarge snapped the phone shut and slid it back into his pocket. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk, the hum of neon reflecting in his tired eyes, then turned his gaze to the row of motorcycles lined up like wolves at rest. He shook his head once, muttering something only he could hear. Then he eased back against the wall, waiting, knowing that the call he had made was already in motion. Inside the bar, the outlaws kept laughing, their leader's voice booming above the rest, mocking Hannah as if the night was theirs to own. None of them noticed the old veteran had gone. None of them noticed the silence outside shifting. The air of the town stirring as engines in distant driveways came to life. The call had traveled fast, faster than their noise, faster than their arrogance, and it carried more weight than any of them were ready to face. The call rippled through the night like a stone dropped into still water, reaching places the outlaws couldn't imagine, places where lights had long been dimmed and houses sat quiet in their routines. But some names carried weight in a town like this, names that didn't need explanation. The Cross family was one of them. To most outsiders, Hannah was just a bartender holding a place together, her strength tucked neatly behind measured movements and steady eyes. But to those who knew, her presence carried the shadow of three men, her older brothers, each carved out by war in their own way. Each returned to this quiet town with stories written not in words but in silence, scars, and discipline. Daniel was the eldest, a Marine who had seen deserts burn red and mountains swallow men whole. He came back with a spine as straight as the rifles he once carried, his voice rarely rising above the calm authority that could silence a room faster than shouting ever could. After years overseas, he had returned to the family farm, working the soil with the same patience he once used to clean his weapon. Each sunrise another drill he answered without complaint. Folks said you could tell he'd been a Marine not because he wore it on his sleeve, but because even in work boots and flannel, he carried himself like a man who was always ready. Marcus, the middle brother, had taken a different path. The army had sent him into jungles and cities where silence was dangerous and nights stretched too long. He had been an army ranger, a man built for missions most people never heard about. He returned quieter than Daniel, less inclined to conversation, but with a watchfulness that unsettled anyone who underestimated him. He worked construction now, his hands thick with calluses, his eyes always scanning, calculating. He never bragged, never raised his hand in a crowd, but there was a weight in his presence, as though he carried the echo of every door he had ever breached. Then there was Caleb, the youngest of three, the one whose name carried whispers even among men who thought themselves hard. A Navy SEAL, trained in waters and shadows, built lean but wired with relentless energy. Caleb had been the one to vanish for months at a time, his service spoken of only in fragments, rumors carried by other veterans who recognized the tattoos on his arm or the quiet way he surveyed a room. When he came back, he settled in town too, living in a small house near the river, always up before dawn, running trails until his boots were caked in mud. He spoke the least of all, but his silence was its own language, and the town understood it. Together, the Cross brothers formed a legacy people didn't speak of loudly, but always remembered. They were men forged in different wars, tempered by different fires, but bound by blood and by the quiet promise they had made when their father passed. Look out for each other. Look out for Hannah. They didn't gather in bars to drink, didn't waste words on threats. They lived quietly, blending into the rhythm of the town, working honest jobs, fixing what needed fixing. But everyone knew that if the wrong kind of trouble ever found Hannah, if anyone ever mistook her calm for weakness, the brothers would rise as one. On nights like this, when engines roared down the highway and outlaws laughed too loud, the memory of that legacy stirred in whispers. Hannah's defiance was her own, but behind was the weight of three men who had faced worse storms than this. The outlaws inside Murphy's bar thought they had cornered a barmaid. What they didn't know was that they had stepped onto ground guarded by a family whose silence was not submission, but patience. Patience that would not last much longer. Engines coughed awake in the quiet corners of town, where houses leaned against the dark and porches sagged under the weight of years. The sound was different from the hollow roar of motorcycles, still cooling outside Murphy's bar. These were deeper, steadier rumbles, The kind that came from old trucks that hauled feed, timber, and memories longer than anyone cared to count. 3 of them, almost in unison, breaking the silence of 3 different streets like distant thunder answering a storm. On the south end of town, Daniel pulled his cap lower as he slid into the worn seat of a Chevy that still smelled faintly of diesel and leather. He had been awake already, sitting at the kitchen table with a ledger of farm expenses, a pencil worn to a nub in his hand. The call hadn't surprised him. He set the pencil down without a word, rose with the calm of a man who had been trained never to waste emotion, and walked out the door. The headlights flared against the barn wall as the truck came alive, its rumble low, deliberate, the kind of sound that warned rather than boasted. Across town, in a subdivision where new houses had begun to sag with neglect, Marcus stepped out of his garage. He had been sanding down a piece of lumber for a porch job. His sleeves rolled past scarred forearms when the phone buzzed. He didn't even take off the work gloves. He wiped the sawdust onto his jeans, grabbed his keys from the workbench, and climbed into the Ford he kept tuned with the same care he once gave to gear that couldn't fail. The truck's engine barked awake, steady and loud in the stillness of neighborhood. A porch light flicked on across the street as a neighbor peeked through blinds, recognizing the sound, recognizing what it meant. Near the river, Caleb's truck roared last, a guttural growl that echoed off the water. He had been sitting on the back steps, lacing his boots, sweat still dry on his shirt from an evening run that carried him through trails only he bothered with anymore. The call had reached him like a bell rung in the distance, and he didn't hesitate. His movements were sharp, economical. He slung a jacket over the passenger seat and shifted the truck into gear, headlights slicing through the damp air that clung to the banks. The river carried the echo of his departure long after he turned toward town. Word spread faster than the trucks moved. Windows lit up as the engines carried through the streets. An old man at the gas station stepped outside to watch the 3 vehicles converge from different directions. He didn't call out, didn't wave. He simply nodded once, the gesture of someone who understood the pattern unfolding. At a diner that had long since closed for the night, the cook wiping down counters paused, listening to the rumble pass, and whispered under his breath, "It's them." Inside Murphy's bar, the Outlaws still laughed, still jeered, still leaned too close to the woman behind the counter. But outside, the ground itself seemed to shift, carrying with it the sound of boots about to find the floorboards. The trucks moved closer, 3 separate shadows converging on one point, pulled not by chance but by blood, by duty, by the unspoken bond of family. The Outlaws thought they had the night in their grip, but the town knew better. The town could hear what was coming. The Outlaw's hand dug deeper into Hannah's waist, his knuckles pressing into her side as though he meant to prove his dominance by the pressure alone. He pulled her slightly toward him, the scrape of her apron against the wood of the counter loud in the suffocating stillness. The laughter that echoed moments before dwindled to uneven chuckles, then died altogether. Even his crew, emboldened by their numbers and their noise, felt the silence closing in, pressing at their throats. It was a kind of quiet that stripped away bravado, the kind that made men suddenly aware of the weight of their own heartbeat. Hannah did not move. Her hands remained flat on the counter, her spine rigid, her chin lifted just enough to meet his sneer with eyes that refused to bend. She did not fight his hold, nor did she yield to it. She stood exactly as she had when he first grabbed her, as if his touch meant nothing, as if his strength had landed against a wall of stone. Her breathing was measured, each inhale slow and deliberate, each exhale steady, so controlled it seemed rehearsed. The outlaw leaned closer, expecting a tremor, a flinch, some crack in her facade. He found none. The regulars in the back booth squirmed in their seats, their shoulders hunched as though trying to fold themselves smaller. Frank pressed a hand against his forehead, his other hand gripping his empty glass like it might anchor him. He couldn't bring himself to look at her, not because he doubted her strength, but because he couldn't stomach his own inaction. Around the room, other men shifted uneasily, their eyes darting from the outlaw's grip to Hannah's face, then away again, the silence pulling them all into complicity. The outlaw's grin faltered for a fraction of a second, just long enough to reveal his surprise. He had expected fear, maybe even a slap or a cry, something to fuel the performance for his crew. But Hannah gave him nothing. That nothingness, that refusal to give him the satisfaction of a reaction, sank deeper than any blow could have. He sneered to cover it, tightening his grip, his words coming low and dangerous. "You think staring me down makes you strong?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, the only change in her expression. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence that followed was sharper than words, and it made the air in the bar unbearable. Even the jukebox seemed to withhold its hum, the neon buzz outside softening as if the whole town were leaning in to listen. One of the crew coughed, the sound breaking too loud against the quiet, and quickly looked away when Hannah's gaze flickered toward him. Another outlaw shifted his weight, boots scuffing against the floorboards, restless under the pressure of calm they couldn't shake. For the first time, the mockery they carried like a weapon felt dull, as if it had struck something harder than they knew how to handle. The man holding her leaned in closer, his voice rising just enough for everyone to hear. "Say something, sweetheart. Scream. Beg. Give me a reason." But she didn't. She stood in that silence, eyes locked, defiant, steady, letting the unbearable quiet do the work for her. In that moment, it was no longer just his hand around her waist that gripped the room. It was her stillness, her refusal to bend. The outlaw might have thought he had her pinned, but the silence told a different story. She wasn't the one trapped. He was. The outlaw's grip had tightened to the point where the fabric of Hannah's apron bunched his fist, his weight leaning toward her as if daring her to resist. The silence inside Murphy's bar pressed harder, smothering even the courage of his crew. It was into that unbearable quiet that the sound came, the squeak of hinges straining, the dull thud of wood against the stopper. The door swung open, carrying with it a draft of night air that cut across the stale smoke and whiskey. Every head turned, though none of the locals had the courage to linger long on the figure framed in the doorway. Daniel Cross stood there, his boots planted firm, shoulders square beneath a worn flannel that did little to hide the build of a man still carrying the habits of a Marine. He didn't rush inside. He didn't need to. The very way he held himself was a message in its own right. Calm, deliberate, heavy with authority that had been drilled into him across oceans and deserts. His eyes, sharp and steady, swept the room with a slow calculation that made the laughter die in throats of the outlaws who had begun to jeer again. Daniel stepped forward, his boots thumping against the old floorboards, each step measured. He carried no weapon in his hands, nothing but the weight of his presence. His jaw was set, his mouth a straight line that revealed nothing and promised plenty. The outlaw holding Hannah glanced at him, his grin twitching as though he meant to make a joke. But the words didn't come. Something about the man who had just entered the bar didn't leave room for humor. Hannah didn't flinch, didn't call out, but a faint shift passed across her shoulders, as if a piece of the burden she had carried alone in the silence was now lifted. Her eyes moved from the outlaw's sneer to her brother's calm, and she allowed herself the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. Daniel's gaze flicked to her, the acknowledgement subtle but binding. He saw her, saw the hand on her waist, and nothing else needed saying. The outlaws shifted in their seats, one clearing his throat, another adjusting his vest, pretending to relax when the tension in their shoulders betrayed them. Their leader, leaning against the wall near the jukebox, smirked faintly, trying to read the man who had just arrived. "And who's this?" he drawled, his tone lighter than the weight in his eyes. Daniel didn't answer right away. He moved to the bar, stopping just short where the outlaw held his sister. His voice, when it came, was quiet, not soft, not weak, quiet in a way that carried further than shouting. "Let her go." The words dropped into the silence like stones in water, rippling outward. No threats, no wasted syllables. Just a command from a man who had given them before, on fields where hesitation meant death. The outlaw's fingers twitched at Hannah's side, his grin faltering, caught between bravado and instinct. Behind him, the others waited for laughter that didn't come, for the noise that had defined them all night to return. It didn't. Daniel's eyes never left the man's face, and the bar held its breath again. The air seemed to bend toward him, pulled by the gravity of his presence. He didn't shout, didn't move to strike, didn't flare with the kind of anger the outlaws might have recognized. He simply stood there, his authority radiating from the stillness of a Marine who had seen more than these men could ever imagine. The outlaw sneered, trying to swallow his unease. But Hannah's brother had already changed the room. The night no longer belonged to them. It had shifted, and though they hadn't realized it yet, the first blow had already been struck. The blow of silence breaking with the swing of a door and the arrival of a man whose calm carried more weight than violence ever could. Daniel stood in the center of the room, his boots planted squarely on the warped floorboards, as though the earth beneath him could not shift. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't clenched his fists, hadn't done anything beyond letting words fall into the air like commands he'd spoken 100 times before. Let her go. Yet the weight of it lingered, pressing against the ears of everyone inside Murphy's bar. The outlaw still had his hand fixed to Hannah's waist, his knuckles whitening as though he meant to prove he couldn't be rattled. But his grin had slipped into something thinner, more brittle. The crew, so loud only moments ago, sat caught in the sudden gravity Daniel brought with him. A man who had barked laughter the loudest now stared down at the scuffed toes of his boots, drumming his fingers against his thigh, in a restless rhythm. Another shifted on his stool, his leather creaking, eyes darting between the outlaw holding Hannah and the man who had just walked through the door. Their bravado had been loud enough to fill the room, but now Daniel's silence drowned it all. Hannah didn't move. She didn't need to. Her stillness, paired with her brother's presence, was stronger than resistance. For the first time since the outlaws arrived, she wasn't standing alone. She could feel it in the way the air shifted, the way the eyes of the regulars lifted just slightly, daring to hope. The leader of the gang, leaning against the wall near the jukebox, gave a slow smirk. Big man in a small town, he drawled, pushing off the wall with deliberate casualness. He crossed his arms, his voice rising just enough for the crew to hear. You think one soldier's gonna change anything? The mockery was there, but so was something else, an edge of caution, a flicker of calculation. He was testing the air, testing Daniel, unsure the man in front of him was the kind of opponent noise could overwhelm. Daniel didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed on the outlaw's hand still clamped on Hannah. The pause stretched long enough for discomfort to settle deeper into the room. Then he spoke again. I said, let her go. The calmness in his tone hadn't changed, but this time it carried with it a quiet finality. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a threat. It was an order, plain and undeniable. The outlaw holding Hannah shifted, his grip loosening without him realizing it. His pride demanded he laugh, demanded he spit in defiance, but instinct, the kind men carry in their bones when they meet someone who cannot be swayed, pressed back harder. His jaw worked as though chewing on words that wouldn't come. The silence pressed heavier than fists, heavier than chains. Frank, still in the back booth, leaned forward slightly, his old eyes fixed on Daniel. He'd seen him grow up, seen him leave in uniform and come back with a steadiness that belonged to men who had seen too much. For the first time all night, Frank's shoulders loosened, as if the burden of helplessness had been lifted by someone who knew how to carry it. Daniel didn't need to move closer. He didn't need to shout. He stood exactly where he was, calm and controlled, the kind of presence that spoke louder than any violence could. One brother had arrived. It was already enough to make a gang of men hesitate, their confidence faltering in the face of silence they couldn't break. The room had shifted, and everyone inside could feel it. The balance of power no longer leaned in the outlaw's favor. The outlaw's hand had loosened just enough on Hannah's waist for her to breathe easier, though he still held her, his pride refusing to yield completely. Daniel's calm, unshaken command lingered in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear, and for the first time, the gang's laughter faltered into uneasy glances. They could sense something shifting beneath the floorboards of Murphy's bar, something heavier than their numbers and louder than their noise. Then the sound came from outside, a low rumble, steady and deep, the growl of another truck pulling onto the gravel lot. The outlaw near the door turned his head, his brow furrowed as headlights washed briefly through the windows. Tires crunched, an engine cut off, and the silence that followed was more telling than any roar of motorcycles. The locals knew the sound. They straightened in their seats just slightly, hope flickering in their eyes. The outlaws, unsettled, exchanged glances they tried to disguise as indifference. The door opened again, more controlled this time, a deliberate push that didn't squeak, but groaned as if announcing another weight pressing into the night. Marcus Cross stepped inside, taller than Daniel, broader in the shoulders, his presence carried a different kind of gravity. Where Daniel's authority came from command and patience, Marcus's came from a sharpened edge, an army ranger who had been trained to move with precision, to calculate risks and dismantle threats. His eyes scanned the room the moment he crossed the threshold, sharp, assessing, as though he could see every angle, every weapon, every exit in a single glance. He didn't hurry. His boots struck the wood in an even rhythm, steady and grounded, each step heavy with purpose. He wore a plain work shirt, sleeves rolled high, sawdust still clinging faintly to his jeans, but nothing about him suggested he had come from a simple construction site. His movements carried the memory of doors kicked in and rooms cleared under fire. He stopped beside Daniel, his body turning slightly so that Hannah was squarely in his line of sight. His jaw set, his lips tightened, but he didn't speak right away. He let his presence settle into the room like a second anchor, doubling the weight of the air. The outlaw leader tilted his head, trying to hold his grin, though it looked more forced now. Well, he said, his voice carrying false humor. Looks like the family reunion's starting early. His crew chuckled weakly, but none of them laughed as freely as before. Marcus finally spoke, his tone lower than Daniel's, rougher, but steady enough to cut through the room like gravel rolling down steel. You got 5 seconds to move your hand off my sister. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every syllable was counted, measured, and heavy with promise. The outlaw's grip twitched, fingers flexing against Hannah's apron. For the first time, sweat glistened at his temple. He looked to his leader, searching for direction, but the man near the jukebox only smirked back, unwilling to show hesitation, yet not eager to answer the demand himself. Hannah stood perfectly still, her body caught between the outlaw's hand and her brother's presence. She didn't move, didn't cry out. She didn't need to. The air itself carried the message. She was no longer standing alone. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, boots firm, arms loose at his sides, not clenched but ready. The deliberate steadiness of his posture spoke louder than fists raised. He wasn't here for theatrics. He was here for resolution. And now, with 2 brothers inside, the outlaws felt the edges of their confidence fray. The game they had thought they were playing had changed, and for the first time, they weren't sure how it would end. The air inside Murphy's bar had grown thick, almost unbreathable. 2 brothers now stood side by side, Daniel with his quiet authority and Marcus with his sharpened steadiness, their presence already enough to shift the balance of the room. The outlaw gripping Hannah was no longer smiling, though his hand still clung stubbornly to her waist. The others sat stiff, laughter gone, their eyes darting nervously between the siblings who had entered and their own leader near the jukebox. The silence stretched until it snapped again, not from inside, but from the low, guttural roar of another engine pulling into the lot. This one came faster, harder, gravel spitting against the siding of the building before the truck cut off. For a beat, there was only the ringing stillness that followed. Then the door opened, and the last of the Cross brothers stepped inside. Caleb's frame was leaner than the others, wiry rather than broad, but his presence carried an intensity that filled the space as surely as muscle. His eyes, sharp and restless, swept the room the moment he crossed the threshold. He didn't look at Hannah first, nor the outlaw holding her. He looked at the exits, the back door near the restrooms, the narrow hall leading to the kitchen, the windows behind the booths. His gaze flicked from faces to hands, pausing on every fist near a bottle, every twitch toward a knife. He moved with a silence that unsettled, not pausing to announce himself or exchange words. His boots barely scuffed the wood as he came forward, his wiry frame coiled, every step calculated like a man accustomed to rooms where one mistake meant death. He stopped just a breath behind his brothers, slightly to the side, completing the triangle of their formation. His silence spoke for him. Caleb didn't need to tell anyone who he was. The look in his eyes did that for him. The outlaw leader's smirk faltered for the first time. He had measured Daniel's calm and Marcus's weight, but this one was different. Caleb's eyes never rested, scanning the room like he had already rehearsed how to dismantle it. To him, Murphy's bar wasn't a bar anymore. It was a battlefield, and he was already mapping every angle. One of the outlaws near the corner shifted uneasily, his chair scraping against the floor as he tried to lean back into false comfort. Caleb's head turned toward him instantly, eyes narrowing, then moved on without a word. The man froze, his hands retreating to the table, suddenly aware of how exposed they felt. Another outlaw muttered something under his breath, but the sound died before it reached volume, smothered by the tension that followed Caleb's gaze. Hannah drew in a slow breath, her first real sign of release since the hand had clamped on her waist. Her youngest brother's presence didn't erase the grip, still holding her, but it shifted the weight of the moment. She wasn't alone now, not by a long shot. Daniel's eyes flicked briefly toward Caleb, the faintest nod of acknowledgement passing between them. Marcus's jaw tightened, his posture lowering ever so slightly, prepared to move if needed. The three brothers didn't need words. Their silence was its own language, built on years of training, years of blood, years of knowing exactly how to stand when others threatened. The outlaw holding Hannah tried to smirk again, tried to cover the tremor that had begun in his hand. But the room had changed beyond his control. Three men now stood where only noise had ruled before, each forged in a different war, each carrying with him the weight of battles that dwarfed whatever this night thought it could be. Caleb's silence pressed hardest of all. His eyes didn't blink. They calculated. They promised. And the promise was simple. This night, this grip, this insult, it would not go unanswered. The bar had never felt smaller. With three brothers now inside, the weight of the air thickened until even the outlaws, men used to swagger and noise, found themselves shrinking into the silence. Daniel, Marcus, and Caleb didn't speak. They didn't need to. They moved as though pulled by the same invisible thread, their boots striking the wood floor in rhythm until they formed a wall around Hannah. Daniel stood directly in front of her, his presence steady and unshaken, his shoulders square like a shield. His calm stare never left the outlaw's hand on his sister's waist, his silence more dangerous than any fist raised in anger. To Daniel, protection wasn't about bluster, it was about certainty. He gave off the quiet force of a man who had already decided what would happen if that hand didn't move. Marcus shifted to the side, his body angling slightly, one foot sliding back in a stance that came instinctively to him. He had spent years clearing rooms where danger lived in corners, and that training bled into every move he made. His eyes scanned the outlaws, one by one, reading their weight, their balance, the twitch in their shoulders, the angle of their boots on the floor. His chest rose with slow, steady breaths, ready to act, his silence daring anyone take the first wrong step. Caleb positioned himself at the other flank, his wiry frame taut, eyes restless and calculating. He wasn't watching one man. He was watching all of them. His gaze flicked from hand to hand, pocket to pocket, reading potential threats before they happened. He didn't stand tall like his brothers. He leaned forward slightly, coiled like a spring, the kind of posture that promised sudden movement. Every outlaw who caught his eye felt it like a blade pressed to the throat, a silent warning that he'd be the first to strike if things turned. Together, they created a circle, their formation enclosing Hannah, the outlaw still gripping her, and the tension that now held the bar captive. Hannah didn't shrink inside their protection. She stood upright, her chin lifted, her stillness unchanged, but the presence of her brothers was like a weight lifting from her shoulders. They hadn't stolen her fight from her. They had joined it, amplifying the quiet defiance she had carried alone until now. The locals watched from their booths, eyes wide, their shame dissolving into something else. The silence that had once been fear transformed into respect. For Hannah, for the brothers, for the kind of bond that spoke louder than jeers or fists. Frank set his empty glass down carefully, his trembling hands finally still, his gaze locked on the family standing in unbroken unity. The outlaws shifted uneasily, their noise stolen from them. The bravado that filled the room minutes earlier had vanished, replaced with hesitation that clung to their faces like sweat. One of them coughed into his fist, trying to break the silence, but the sound fell flat, swallowed by the immovable wall of the crossed siblings. The leader leaned forward, his smirk fighting to survive, but even he couldn't mask the flicker of unease in his eyes. He had walked into a bar thinking it was his to own. Now he stood inside a room where the ground itself seemed to belong to someone else. The formation around Hannah wasn't just protection. It was a declaration. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. The silence deepened, but it was no longer unbearable. It was charged, heavy, reverent. For the first time all night, the power in Murphy's bar didn't belong to men with patches on their backs. It belonged to the family standing shoulder to shoulder, silent, immovable, and unbreakable. The silence stretched long, thick as tar, pressing against every wall of Murphy's bar. The Cross siblings stood in formation, their bodies forming a wall around Hannah, their presence transforming the room into something harder, heavier, impossible to ignore. The Outlaws, once loud and boastful, now sat pinned in their seats by the weight of three men who hadn't raised a fist but had already shifted the balance of power. It was a kind of silence that demanded someone break it, and the only one willing was their leader. Jack Mercer, known across county lines as Bone, rose from where he had been leaning near the jukebox. He carried himself like a man who had been feared too long to remember what humility felt like. His leather cut was heavier with patches than the rest of his crew, each one stitched like proof of battle survived, scars worn on fabric rather than skin. His boots struck the floor hard as he stepped forward, the kind of stomp meant to reclaim ground. His face twisted into a sneer that showed he wasn't about to let the night end with him looking smaller than anyone else. He stopped just short of Daniel, his chest broad, his jaw working with the stubbornness of a man who had spent his life refusing to yield. He spat on the floor, the sound sharp against the hush, the wet mark spreading on the wood between them. The gesture was more than defiance. It was contempt, a deliberate insult meant to reset the room, to remind everyone watching that this was a stage, his show. His crew chuckled uneasily, forcing out laughter that didn't carry far, their eyes flicking nervously between Bone and the brothers. 3 against a dozen, Bone said, his voice low but sharp, carrying through the silence. You think that's enough to scare me? His eyes slid past Daniel to Marcus, then Caleb, before settling finally on Hannah. Your sister's got fire, I'll give her that. Brave for a barmaid, but brave don't count for much when the numbers are this lopsided. Daniel didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the spit on the floor. His steady gaze stayed locked on Bone, calm and unshaken. Marcus shifted slightly, weight settling on a back foot, a subtle readiness that made the outlaw leader pause for the briefest moment. Caleb's eyes swept Bone up and down, measuring, calculating, already marking every twitch of his shoulders, every gesture of his hands. Bone's smirk flickered, but he pushed harder. You boys think walking in here means this is over? I've put down men tougher than you. Marines, Rangers, SEALs. It don't matter. You all bleed the same. His crew cheered faintly, their voices lacking conviction. But he took it anyway, soaking up the noise like fuel for his pride. Hannah stood steady behind her brothers, her eyes narrowed, her chin lifted. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her silence was a blade in itself, cutting sharper than the jeers Bone tried to revive. The bar waited, every soul inside caught between fear and awe. Bone had spit his challenge onto the floor, unwilling to lose face, unwilling to bow to the weight of 3 veterans who stood in calm defiance. But even as he bristled, his eyes betrayed what his voice refused to admit. The balance of power had already shifted, and no amount of noise could take it back. The spit on the floor glistened under the dim neon glow, a crude punctuation mark left by Jack Bone Mercer to claim the room as his. His crew shifted in their seats, emboldened by the gesture, but their eyes betrayed unease. They had seen the Cross brothers gather without raising a hand, without raising a voice, and somehow that silence weighed more than their numbers. Bone smirked, his chest puffed, tried to fill the bar with bravado, yet the stillness remained, unbroken and suffocating. Daniel stood at the center of it, his boots planted square, his arms loose at his sides, his posture immovable. He didn't look at the spit. He didn't need to. His eyes stayed fixed on the outlaw's hand still gripping Hannah's waist. That single detail, more than the jeers, more than the insults, had drawn every fiber of his focus. His sister had stood her ground, had carried silence like armor, but the line had been crossed too far. When he spoke, his voice was calm, low, carrying no trace of anger. It was the kind of tone men only learned after years of giving commands under fire, words designed to cut through chaos and leave no room for misinterpretation. Let her go, he said, each syllable steady. Then, after a beat, he added the weight of finality. Last chance. The phrase struck the room harder than a shout. It didn't rise, it didn't thunder, but it landed with a force that pressed on the ears of every man present. The regulars in the back booth stiffened, breaths caught in their throats, knowing those words carried no bluff. Frank, his old hands trembling slightly, closed his eyes for a moment, whispering a prayer not for the Cross family, but for the men foolish enough to test him. Bones' grin twitched, his jaw tightening as though he wanted to laugh it off, but the sound never came. He glanced at the outlaw still holding Hannah, and in that glance was the first flicker of doubt. The man's grip faltered, his fingers tightening and loosening as if they weren't sure which way to go. The crew looked on restless, their forced smirks slipping into unease. Daniel didn't move closer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were heavy enough to stand on their own, weighted by a lifetime of discipline and a promise that had never been broken. He had said, "Last chance," and everyone in the room understood what that meant. Marcus's shoulders shifted subtly, his stance tightening, ready to act the second those words were ignored. Caleb's eyes swept the room again, calculating every angle, every potential strike, his silence sharpening into a blade. Hannah, still held by the outlaw's grip, stood taller, her chin raised. She knew her brother's voice. She knew he didn't waste words. Bones spat again, this time closer to Daniel's boots, tried to reclaim ground he had already lost. "Or what?" he snarled, his voice louder now, angrier, covering the unease creeping into his tone. But the question hung hollow. Everyone in Murphy's bar, outlaw and local alike, already knew the answer. Daniel's calm warning didn't need to be explained. It didn't need volume, threats, or spectacle. It was enough on its own. The room trembled under the weight of it. The outlaws bristled, their leader sneering. But beneath it all lay the knowledge that something unspoken had shifted. The brothers hadn't come here to posture. They had come here to end it. And with 3 words, "Last chance," Daniel had made it clear the time for choices was almost gone. The weight of Daniel's words still lingered in the air, thick and immovable, a warning that everyone in Murphy's bar understood, even if only one man had been bold enough to test it. The outlaw's grip on Hannah had slackened ever so slightly, his pride urging him to hold firm while instinct screamed at him to release. The hesitation was visible in his twitching fingers, a small tremor that carried across the silence like thunder. Around them, the crew fidgeted in their seats, their postures no longer the picture of confidence. Something had shifted, and they all knew it. But bravado is a stubborn companion, and the gang clung to it like a lifeline. One of the outlaws nearest the bar leaned forward, his hand brushing the neck of an empty beer bottle. He didn't grab it, not yet, but his fingers lingered there long enough for Marcus to notice. Marcus's eyes, sharp and unblinking, followed the movement, his stance adjusting by a fraction. Across the room, another man slid his boot against the floor, nudging a pool cue closer with a heel, trying to make the act look casual. Caleb's gaze cut to him instantly, and in that glance the outlaw froze, his attempt at subtlety unraveling under the weight of eyes that had measured threats in far darker places. The room had become a battlefield without a shot fired, every man calculating, waiting for the spark that would tip silence into chaos. Hannah remained still, her chin raised, her breath measured. She could feel the outlaw's hand at her waist trembling now, though he tried to mask it with a sneer. She didn't look at him anymore. She kept her eyes on Daniel, on the calm authority in his face, steady as stone. That calm was both shield and trigger, comfort for her, a goad for the outlaws who bristled at the quiet power it carried. The locals sat frozen in the booths, eyes wide, knuckles tight around glasses they no longer drank from. They knew what was about to happen. They had seen enough bar fights to know when noise turned into violence, but this was no ordinary scuffle. This was something heavier. It was in the way the brothers stood, not posturing, not flexing, just steady, deliberate, waiting. Men who had been trained not to waste movement didn't shift unless they intended to act. That knowledge sat in the gut of everyone watching, making the silence unbearable. Bone, still standing near the jukebox, spit once more, but this time the act carried less arrogance than before. His eyes narrowed as he studied the 3 brothers, his jaw tightening. He could feel the loyalty of his crew wavering, could sense their hesitation. Pride demanded he push forward, but instinct whispered caution, and pride was the louder voice. The air itself seemed to pulse. Every sound was amplified. The hum of the neon sign, the faint creak of the ceiling fan, the sharp inhale of a regular trying not to choke on fear. Hands hovered over glass, wood, steel. The outlaw at Hannah's side adjusted his grip, his knuckles whitening again, a decision forming in his eyes. Caleb's stance tightened. Marcus leaned a hair forward. Daniel's calm stare never wavered. Seconds stretched long, heavy, suspended like a wire pulled too tight. The whole bar seemed to understand that the moment could not hold forever. It would snap, and when it did, the silence that had carried so much weight would explode into something none of them could walk away from unchanged. The air inside Murphy's bar quivered like a string pulled to breaking. Every breath seemed louder than it should have been. Every creak of the old floorboards beneath boots a threat waiting to spill into violence. Daniel's calm warning still hung in the space. Marcus and Caleb ready to sides. The outlaws restless in their seats. Fingers twitching toward bottles, cues, and knives. It would have taken almost nothing. A shove, a raised fist, to scrape a chair, to unleash the storm. And then, when the silence was so taut it could no longer bear its own weight, another voice rose. It wasn't Daniel's, though his words had already anchored the room. It wasn't Marcus's gravel or Caleb's cold silence. It was Hannah's. Her voice cut through the tension like glass breaking, sharp and steady, carrying more force than shouting ever could. "I don't need saving," she said, her words low but clear, reaching every corner of the bar. The outlaw gripping her waist stiffened, his fingers twitching at her apron, as though he didn't know whether to hold tighter or let go. The room stilled again, every head turning, waiting. Her eyes swept across the faces before her. First the outlaws, then the regulars, then her brothers. She didn't waver, didn't falter, her chin high and her tone sharpened by the fire that had been simmering all night. "What I need," she continued, "is respect." The word landed with the weight of a hammer. Respect. Something the outlaws had mocked. Something the locals had withheld in their silence. Something her brothers had always carried but rarely named. It wasn't a plea, wasn't a demand for rescue. It was a statement, carved clean out of the air, undeniable. The outlaw holding her blinked, his sneer faltering. He had expected fear or gratitude for the intervention of her brothers. Instead, he got defiance, wrapped not in anger but in clarity. His hand loosened slightly against her side, his bravado shaken by the sheer certainty in her voice. Bones shifted by the jukebox, his smirk fading as he studied her. He had heard men beg, curse, spit in his face, but what he heard now was different. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't even threat. It was truth, spoken so plainly that for a heartbeat, even he couldn't laugh it off. The regulars in the booths felt it too. Frank, who had spent the night with his eyes downcast, finally lifted his gaze. His hands, which had trembled earlier, steadied on the table. Around him, others shifted, no longer just witnesses cowering in silence, but men realizing they had let one woman carry the weight of the night alone. Her words pricked their shame like needles. Daniel's eyes softened just enough to show he heard her, understood her. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Marcus's jaw unclenched, his shoulders lowering a fraction. Caleb, still coiled and scanning, paused his restless eyes just long enough to meet hers, a silent acknowledgement that her words carried as much force as any of theirs. The outlaws bristled under the statement, their earlier noise and laughter now brittle in their throats. Respect was a word they had never intended to give, but in that moment they felt its absence pressing on them, stripping their arrogance bare. They had turned the night into a spectacle, but Hannah had turned it back on them, reducing their numbers, their noise, their bluster to nothing more than dust at her feet. The silence that followed was no longer unbearable. It was reverent, charged with something deeper. Her voice had cracked the night wide open, showing the truth neither fists nor weapons could deny. She didn't need saving. She needed respect. And in that instant, even the men too proud to admit it knew she had already taken it. The outlaw at the bar couldn't hold his composure any longer. Hannah's words had stripped away the thin veneer of control, and Daniel's warning had left him cornered between pride and fear. His crew looked to him, waiting for someone to act, waiting for noise to cover the silence that had weighed too heavily. With a guttural shout, one of them snapped. A chair scraped violently across the floor as he lunged, his boots hammering against the wood. His hand outstretched for a bottle on the counter that he meant to swing. The motion shattered the stillness. Before the man could close the distance, Caleb moved. It wasn't with bluster or sound, but with a speed born of long practice, his wiry frame snapping into motion like a spring uncoiled. He stepped off his back foot, closing the gap in less than a heartbeat, his arms sweeping low, redirecting the outlaw's momentum with precision that spoke of years spent in rooms where hesitation meant death. The bottle never reached the air. Caleb's hand locked around the man's wrist, twisting sharply, and the outlaw's snarl broke into a cry of pain as glass clattered harmlessly back to the bar. The eruption was immediate. Another outlaw surged from his stool, fists clenched, the scrape of metal against him betraying a knife drawn from his belt. Marcus stepped forward then, his stance tightening, his fist driving into the man's chest before the blade could clear the leather. The outlaw staggered back, air knocked from his lungs, crashing into the table behind him as glasses shattered to the floor. Daniel didn't move at first. He didn't need to. His eyes stayed locked on Bone, who hadn't flinched, who watched with the stillness of a man weighing the cost of pushing forward. Around them, the bar had erupted, chairs toppling, locals ducking low in their booths, the air filled with shouts and the crash of wood against wood. Yet through it all, the brothers moved with a calm efficiency that seemed at odds with the chaos. Caleb released the outlaw's wrist only after he had driven the man to his knees, his boot planted against the floorboards, keeping him down. His gaze flicked instantly to the next threat, sharp, calculating, never resting. Marcus turned slightly, his broad shoulders catching another man mid-swing, the pool cue glancing off his forearm before he drove an elbow back into the attacker's jaw. Daniel stepped finally, not with speed but with precision, his hand pushing the outlaw off Hannah's waist, sending the man stumbling back with nothing more than forceful certainty. The regulars watched in stunned silence, their fear now mixed with awe. This wasn't a bar fight, not the wild, reckless brawls they had seen spill through Murphy's before. This was controlled, deliberate, each strike measured, each movement purposeful. The Cross brothers didn't waste breath, didn't shout or curse. They moved as though they had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, each knowing where the other would be, each filling the gaps without pause. Hannah stood steady behind them, her breathing quick but her posture unbroken. She didn't cower or shrink back. She knew her brothers weren't there to silence her voice, but to make sure it was heard. The outlaws bristled and struck, but each move was met with precision, every lunge intercepted, every blow answered. And still in the eye of the chaos, Daniel's calm words lingered in the air, a weight that had not lifted. Last chance. For one outlaw, the chance had already passed. For the rest, it was only beginning to slip away. The moment Caleb intercepted the first lunge, the fragile balance of silence splintered and the room gave way to chaos. The hum of neon lights was drowned out by the crash of wood and glass, the sharp crack of fists finding flesh, and the guttural shouts of men too proud to back down. Murphy's bar, once a quiet refuge at the end of a long day, had transformed into a battlefield lit by buzzing signs and flickering bulbs. A table overturned near the jukebox, its legs snapping as two men grappled across it, their boots smashing bottles that rained glass across the floor. Chairs toppled one after another, weapons improvised from desperation, the thud of wood against bone echoing through the bar. One outlaw swung a pool cue wide, the arc catching a hanging lamp and sending it spinning, lights strobing across the room in frantic flashes. Marcus met the cue's strike with his forearm, the crack ringing out as he seized the wood and wrenched it free, shoving the outlaw back with a shove that rattled the walls. His movements were clean, efficient, honed by years where chaos was routine. He didn't waste energy. Every motion was measured, every strike calculated to end an attack before it could spread. His fist hammered into the outlaw's jaw, sending him sprawling across the floor, blood blooming from his split lip. Across the room, Caleb moved like quicksilver, slipping between bodies with wiry speed. An outlaw lunged with a broken bottle, jagged edges flashing under the neon, but Caleb stepped in, trapping the man's wrist, his elbow driving into the outlaw's sternum. The bottle clattered harmlessly to the floor as the man crumpled, air driven from his lungs. Caleb didn't linger. His eyes swept, already calculating the next angle, the next threat rising from a mess. Daniel was slower, steadier, but no less precise. He moved with a calm authority that made his every strike final. One outlaw charged, swinging wild with chain wrapped around his fist. Daniel stepped in, catching the man's arm mid-swing, twisting until the chain fell slack. His other hand drove into the man's chest, sending him crashing back into a row of bottles that shattered behind the counter, liquor spilling in rivers across the wood. Daniel didn't even raise his voice. His silence carried the weight of inevitability, his actions clear. This was over, whether the outlaws admitted it or not. Through the chaos, Hannah stood near the bar, her breast steady though her heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't cower behind her brothers. She stayed upright, her gaze fixed on the storm that had erupted, refusing to let herself be erased from the center of it. Her apron was torn, her hair loose around her face, but her expression was unbroken. She had spoken her truth, and now her brothers carved a space to ensure it could not be dismissed. Glass crunched under boots. Beer pooled sticky across the floor, fists hammered against flesh with sickening thuds. The locals huddled low in their booths, some shielding their faces, others peeking over the edges to witness what had become of their quiet bar. What they saw wasn't reckless brawling. It was discipline against chaos, calm precision against wild fury. And yet, even as tables splintered and neon light flickered over the carnage, one figure hadn't moved. Bones stood near the jukebox, his smirk thinner now, his jaw clenched as he watched his crew falter against the immovable wall of the Cross family. He hadn't stepped forward yet, but his stillness was its own threat. Amid the shattered glass and bruised fists, one truth loomed clearer than the chaos itself. The night was far from finished, and the true reckoning hadn't even begun. The chaos inside Murphy's bar was raw and loud. Tables crashing, bottles shattering, fists finding their targets in quick, brutal succession. But in the middle of it all, there was something that did not look like chaos at all. The three Cross brothers moved as though they had drilled for this very moment, their bodies falling into a rhythm no one else could match. To the outlaws, it looked like instinct, but to those who understood, it was precision, years of training, discipline forged in places where hesitation meant death. Daniel was the anchor. He moved slower than the others, but every strike he delivered ended something. When an outlaw lunged at him with a broken chair leg, Daniel didn't flinch or step back. He pivoted just enough to let the momentum slide past, his hand snapping to the man's wrist, twisting hard until it clattered to the floor. His other fist, calm and deliberate, drove into the outlaw's gut with enough force to fold him to the ground. Daniel didn't waste movement. He never chased a man, never raised his voice. He was a still point in the storm, and his calm was more terrifying than rage. Marcus was a hammer. His body carried power that seemed too much for the narrow space of the bar, his shoulders swinging heavy as he intercepted every outlaw who tried to flank. One came at Hannah from the side, a knife glinting under neon. Marcus stepped in without hesitation, his arm shooting forward to catch the man at the throat, pinning him to the wall so hard the wood behind him creaked. With his free hand, Marcus wrenched the blade free and sent it skidding harmlessly across the floor. His movements were strong, but never reckless. Even his fury was tempered by control. Every action meant to disable, not flail. Caleb was a blade. He moved fast, weaving between the bigger bodies, never staying in one place long enough to be cornered. An outlaw swung wide with a pool cue, but Caleb was already gone, ducking low, his elbows smashing into the man's ribs. Another tried to grab him from behind, but Caleb shifted his weight, slipping free before driving a knee back into the attacker's thigh. His silence made him seem almost ghost-like, always where he needed to be, never lingering, never wasting energy. His wiry frame moved with the efficiency of a knife cut, sharp, fast, leaving no doubt once it landed. Together, the three brothers formed a unit, each one filling the gaps the others left. When Marcus shoved one outlaw backward, Caleb was already there to sweep his legs, sending him sprawling. When Caleb's quick movements drew too much attention, Daniel stepped forward, his larger frame absorbing the force of the next rush, giving his youngest brother time to reset. They didn't need to look at one another. They didn't need words. Their bond, drilled deep by blood and by service, was enough. The outlaws, by contrast, were noise and disarray. They shouted over one another, stumbled into each other, swung too wide or too wild. Their fists landed heavy, but rarely were they aimed. Against the three Cross brothers, their numbers meant little. They weren't a unit. They weren't a family forged in discipline. They were just men swinging in the dark. The locals, crouched low in their booths, began to see it. Their fears shifted into something else: respect, awe, even shame. They watched as Daniel, Marcus, and Caleb moved with a precision that didn't belong to ordinary men. Murphy's Bar wasn't just witnessing a fight. It was watching soldiers fall into formation once again, not on a battlefield overseas, but in the small town they had come home to protect. And in that moment, it became clear the Cross brothers weren't just defending Hannah. They were dismantling the myth of power the outlaws thought they owned, piece by piece, strike by strike, with the kind of purpose only men who had lived through war could carry. The bar floor had become a graveyard of noise and pride. Within minutes of the first strike, half the outlaw crew lay scattered among the wreckage of overturned tables and shattered glass. Groans filled the spaces where laughter had once roared, men clutching ribs, jaws, or wrists bent at wrong angles. The sticky floor was streaked with spilled beer and blood, the neon lights buzzing overhead as if mocking the gang's collapse. One outlaw, the same who had lunged with the bottle, knelt gasping against the base of the counter, his wrist bent awkwardly, his face pale as sweat dripped down his temples. Another sprawled on his back in the corner, Marcus's last blow having robbed him of his breath, his chest rising and falling shallowly. Caleb had dropped two more, one doubled over from a knee to the stomach, another pinned by the weight of a broken chair across his chest. Every one of them had started with noise and ended with silence, their confidence bleeding out into the floorboards. The rest of the crew had gone still. Their boots scraped against the sticky floor as they shifted, hesitating, their fists still raised but looser now, their bravado caught somewhere between pride and self-preservation. They looked to Bone, their leader, their smirks trembling into uncertainty. He had built his reputation on fear, on commanding rooms by the weight of his presence. But now even his men weren't sure if his shadow was big enough to cover what they faced. Hannah's brothers stood like sentinels in the wreckage, each breathing steady, unhurried. Daniel didn't chase the fight. He stood with his shoulders squared, calm as ever, eyes locked on the men still upright. He looked as though he had all the time in the world, as though every second of hesitation from the gang was another nail hammered into their coffin. Marcus's chest heaved from the exertion, but his stance was still rock solid, daring anyone else to step forward. Caleb moved like he always did, restless, pacing slightly, his eyes never still, daring one of the outlaws to test him again. Hannah, still standing near the bar, wiped the corner of her mouth where dust and a trace of blood had smeared when the outlaw's grip had dragged her earlier. She hadn't moved behind them. She remained upright, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on the men who still held out. She didn't shout or jeer. Her silence was sharper than any insult, her steady stare cutting deeper into their pride than fists ever could. The regulars peeked up from their booths, their fears softening into something else. They had spent the night looking away, too scared to intervene, but now they looked on with awe at the siblings standing unbroken. Some shifted uncomfortably, realizing the shame of their silence, but none could deny the respect now thick in the air. The outlaws who remained upright twitched, their fingers brushing against bottles or cues, but none moved. Their hesitation grew heavier with every second. They had numbers, still, but numbers no longer meant anything in the face of what stood before them. They were fighters, yes, but the Cross brothers were something different, calm, disciplined, unshaken. The neon hummed overhead, the jukebox long silenced. The room caught in a pause that felt like judgment itself. Half the gang lay broken on the floor, and the rest, though still standing, felt the truth pressing in. Their power was gone. What remained was only choice, whether to fall beside their brothers or walk away before the last of their pride was ground into the dust. Bone Mercer had watched his men crumble under the weight of the Cross brothers, one after another collapsing into groans on the sticky floor, their pride scattered like shards of glass among spilled beer and broken tables. His smirk had thinned with every body that fell, But pride was a venom he had long ago swallowed whole, and now it burned too deeply to spit out. He straightened from a jukebox where he had lingered, rolling his shoulders as though shaking off the hesitation that had infected the rest of his crew. His boots thudded across the wreckage-strewn floor, slow and deliberate, his eyes locked on Daniel with a hatred that dared anyone to look away. In his hand, a length of chain gleamed under flickering neon. He had carried it coiled at his belt like an afterthought, but now it unspooled, clinking against itself as he let it hang, heavy, metal links tapping the wood with each swing. The sound cut through the room, drawing the attention of locals and outlaws alike. With every pass of the chain, Bones' bravado grew louder, as though the weapon itself could call back the fear his crew had already lost. "You think this is done?" His voice was sharp, edged with something more desperate than confident. He pointed the chain toward Daniel, then toward Marcus and Caleb, his lip curling. "You think 3 uniforms get to walk in here and take what's mine? You don't know me. You don't know Bone Mercer. I've ruled every road from here to the state line, and I don't bow to anyone, not soldiers, not cops, not anyone." The words echoed off the walls, but they didn't land with the same weight as Daniel's earlier command. The regulars in the booths watched him, their fear dulled now into wary contempt. His men, though still standing, shifted uneasily, none rushing to back him as they once might have. The chain clinked again as Bones swung it higher, testing its weight in his palm. Marcus stepped forward, his stance tightening, his broad shoulders shifting like a shield preparing to absorb the first strike. Caleb's eyes followed every twitch of Bones' arm, calculating the arc, the speed, the distance, his wiry frame already coiled to intercept. But it was Daniel who remained steady, his gaze locked on Bone without blinking, his posture unchanged. The chain lashed out suddenly, a wild swing that cracked against the edge of the bar, splinters flying as Hannah flinched back. The sound was meant to intimidate, meant to remind everyone of Bones' power, but instead it revealed his desperation. He swung again, this time wider, aiming for Marcus, who lifted his arm and caught the blow across his forearm. The impact rattled the wood floor beneath them, but Marcus didn't stagger. He absorbed it, gritting his teeth, then shoved forward with enough force to send Bones stumbling a step back. The neon light buzzed overhead, flickering across Bones' face as he snarled, tightening his grip on the chain, swinging again. Caleb moved this time, stepping into the arc, his hand snapping out to catch the chain mid-swing. The links bit into his palm, but he twisted hard, redirecting the momentum. Bones' eyes widened as the weapon he had claimed as his authority was wrenched from his control, clattering to the ground. Still, he lunged, fists bare now, striking wild as though rage alone could carry him through. He caught Daniel's shoulder with a glancing blow, the first contact anyone had made on the eldest brother that night. But Daniel didn't flinch. His hand rose, calm and steady, and shoved Bone back with force that planted him against the wall, rattling the jukebox once more. The bar fell quiet again, save for the sound of Bones' ragged breathing. His chain lay at Caleb's feet, useless now. His crew was scattered on the floor, too broken or too afraid to rise. And though he still stood, fists clenched and chest heaving, the room no longer belonged to him. It hadn't for some time. The last stand of Jack Mercer was nothing more than noise against the silence of 3 brothers who refused to move. Bones' chest heaved as though every breath were dragged from a furnace. His knuckles were raw, his eyes wild, sweat streaking through the grime on his face. Around him, his men lay broken, groaning on the sticky floorboards, their pride shattered alongside tables and bottles. The neon lights above buzzed and flickered, throwing jagged shadows across the wreckage. And still he stood, fists raised, stubborn defiance etched into every line of his face. He had nothing left but noise and pride, and both were wearing thin. Daniel hadn't moved much since the first strike had been thrown that night. He stood steady at the center of it all, shoulders squared, his calm gaze never leaving Bone. While Marcus absorbed the weight of the chain's wild arcs and Caleb stripped it away with practiced precision, Daniel had been the anchor, unshaken. Now the moment had arrived when stillness had to shift into action. Bone lunged again, his fists flying wild, rage replacing precision. He swung left, then right, his strikes sloppy but heavy, fueled by desperation more than skill. Daniel didn't meet them with fists of his own. He let the blows glance off his forearms. Let the outlaw wear himself down with each wasted swing. The locals in the booths held their breath, their eyes wide, knowing they were watching something reach its end. Then Daniel stepped forward, closing the last inches between them. The outlaw raised his arm for another wild punch, but Daniel's hand shot up, gripping his wrist mid-swing, freezing it in the air. For the first time that night, Bones' face faltered, shock cutting through the fury. His other fist came up, but Daniel's elbow moved faster, driving into the outlaw's chest with crushing precision. The sound was a dull thud, heavy enough to steal breath. Bones staggered, his boots sliding in spilled beer, his body slamming back against the bar. The chain, already knocked loose, clattered once more to the floor, as if echoing the moment. It struck the wood with a metallic rattle that seemed to carry further than the outlaw's grunt, rolling across the silence that followed. Daniel's finishing blow was not a wild strike, not a flourish for show. It was a single, deliberate punch that landed squarely against Bones' jaw, snapping his head to the side. The outlaw collapsed in a heap, his body crumpling against the base of the jukebox, arms slack, his breath ragged but his fight gone. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The regulars stared from their booths, their drinks forgotten, their shame turned into awe. The remaining outlaws froze, half risen but unwilling to move further. Every eye was drawn to Daniel, who stood steady, lowering his hand with the calm of a man who hadn't fought to prove himself, but simply to end what needed ending. Hannah exhaled, the sound sharp in the quiet, her shoulders lowering for the first time in what felt like hours. Marcus stood tall, his forearm still marked by the chain's bruising impact, his chest rising heavy but proud. Caleb paced once, his wiry frame coiled, his eyes scanning the room, ensuring no hidden threat remained. But there were no more threats. The fight was over. Bone Mercer lay unconscious, his crew beaten, their noise silenced. The chain, once swung as a symbol of control, rested useless on the floor, his metallic rattle the only reminder of what had been. Daniel looked once to Hannah, then to his brothers. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The silence of Murphy's bar was no longer heavy with fear. It was reverence, respect carved out by blood, discipline, and one strike that ended the night. The wreckage of Murphy's bar lay in silence. Broken chairs leaned against the walls like casualties. Bottles lay in glittering fragments across the sticky floor, and the jukebox, rattled from the fight, hummed faintly with static. Bone Mercer was crumpled near its base. The chain he had once swung in defiance lying beside him, coiled and harmless. His crew groaned in scattered heaps, half-conscious, their swagger drained into floorboards. The Cross brothers stood over it all, steady and unshaken, their breathing heavy but controlled. Hannah leaned against the counter, apron torn, hair disheveled, but her eyes were steady, proud. The storm had passed, and in its wake was a silence thick with respect. Then came the sound that reminded everyone the outside world still existed. A faint wail carried on the night air, distant but growing louder. Sirens, red and blue light bled to the cracks of the front windows, flashing across the broken glass, turning the wreckage into a stuttering kaleidoscope of color. Tires crunched over gravel as a county cruiser rolled up the bar, its headlights sweeping over the outlaw motorcycles still lined outside like relics of pride now abandoned. The door creaked open slowly, the hinges groaning as a figure stepped inside. Deputy Reeves filled the doorway, his hat slightly askew, his badge glinting as the red and blue lights from his car pulsed behind him. His eyes widened as they swept the room. At the overturned tables, the blood on the floor, the outlaws strewn like wreckage, and the three brothers standing silent at the center of it all. "What in God's name?" Reeves muttered, his voice caught somewhere between disbelief and resignation. He stepped forward cautiously, his boots crunching against glass, one hand resting near the holster at his hip. Though he didn't draw, he wasn't looking at the outlaws. He was looking at Daniel, Marcus, and Caleb, as though piecing together what had happened was easier through them than through the wreckage itself. Daniel met his gaze calmly, his posture steady, unshaken by the arrival law. Marcus crossed his arms over his chest, silent but looming, while Caleb lingered slightly behind, his sharp eyes still scanning the room, restless even though the fight had ended. Hannah didn't move. She stood tall at the bar, apron torn but her voice ready if she needed it. The outlaws who were still conscious stirred uneasily at the sight of the deputy. Their earlier bravado shriveled to silence. None of them wanted to be the first to speak, not with their leader unconscious and their power stripped away. Reeves let his gaze drift over them briefly, then back to the siblings. His lips pressed into a thin line, the weight of his sigh heavy enough to carry through the room. "I got a call there was trouble," Reeves said at last, his voice louder now, filling the silence. "Guess I'm late." His eyes dropped to Bone's slack figure near the jukebox, then to the chain on the floor. He bent down, lifted the metal links with a gloved hand, and let them dangle once before setting them on the counter. The red and blue lights outside pulsed steadily through the windows, casting long shadows of the brothers across the wreckage. Reeves straightened, his gaze softer now, as though he understood more than he was willing to put into words. "Looks like you handled it," he said quietly. No one answered. The silence of the Cross brothers said enough. The fight was over. The town was watching, and the law had arrived only in time to see the aftermath written in bruises, blood, and silence. The red and blue lights from Deputy Reeves' cruiser still flickered faintly across the bar's windows, bathing the wreckage in shifting colors that made everything feel suspended between past and present, chaos and calm. Glass sparkled where bottles had shattered, beer seeped into the cracks of the wood floor, and the jukebox hummed low and broken, its neon strip sputtering like the heartbeat of a room still catching its breath. The outlaws were scattered across the floor, some groaning, others too still to rise, their pride stripped away with their strength. At the center of it all stood Hannah Cross. Her apron was torn, its string hanging loose at her side. Strands of hair had come free, sticking to her face, dusted with sweat and smoke. A bruise was beginning to form where a rough hand had once clamped down too hard, the faint mark cutting against her skin like a memory. Yet she stood straight, shoulders back, chin lifted. The tremor of fear that had run through her earlier had burned itself out. What remained was steel. Her brothers flanked her, forming a wall without needing to touch her. Daniel, steady as a mountain, stood nearest, his calm presence still anchoring the room. Marcus loomed just behind, his broad frame carrying the weight of someone who had absorbed blows, so his family didn't have to. Caleb paced lightly at the edges, his restless gaze scanning the shadows, the exits, the wreckage, unwilling to drop his guard even now. They were her shield, yes, but in their presence she wasn't hidden. She was illuminated. Hannah drew in a breath and let it out slow, the sound audible in the stillness. The locals, who had once ducked their heads and averted their eyes, now looked at her without flinching. There was no pity in their gaze, no dismissal. There was respect. She had not screamed, had not begged. She had stood steady, endured the grip, and when the silence had threatened to suffocate, it was her voice that had broken it. She had claimed her dignity not by waiting to be saved, but by demanding the one thing no outlaw, no drunken hand, no small-town whisper could ever strip away: respect. Deputy Reeves lingered by the door, his hat low, his eyes drifting from the outlaws to the Cross siblings to Hannah herself. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The truth of what had happened was written clearly enough in the broken tables, in the groans of men who thought they could take what wasn't theirs, in the quiet strength of a woman who had refused to bow. Hannah lifted her chin a little higher, her eyes sweeping across the room. She wasn't just a bartender anymore, the one who wiped down counters and poured drinks while men tried to talk over her. She wasn't the barmaid mocked for her courage or grabbed as though she were nothing more than part of the furniture. She stood now as something else entirely. Not a victim, but a survivor, her strength framed in the silence her brothers had secured. The neon lights buzzed above, the red and blue flickers fading as Reeves' cruiser idled quietly outside, and the air of Murphy's bar shifted. The night had been scarred, but in its aftermath, something stronger had been carved into its floorboards. Hannah stood in the light of it, her brothers at her side, her voice still echoing silently in every corner of the room. She didn't need saving. She had demanded respect, and she had taken it. By morning, the wreckage of Murphy's bar had been cleared into neat piles, though the cracks in the floor and the stains on the wood still bore witness to what had unfolded the night before. The jukebox sat silent, its neon strip burned out completely, while the bar stools leaned against the wall. some with legs splintered and others still slick with spilled beer. The outlaw motorcycles that had lined the gravel lot were gone, their engines never roaring to life again on county roads. In their place was silence, broken only by the hum of cicadas and the early rattle of trucks heading out to the fields. Whispers spread faster than any official word. By the time the church bells rang their first chime of the day, stories had already passed from the bar to the diner, from the diner to the feed store, from the feed store to the courthouse steps. Each retelling bent the details slightly, but one truth remained constant. The Cross family had stood unbroken, and Bone Mercer's crew had been scattered like leaves in a storm. Some said Marcus caught a knife with his bare hand. Others swore Caleb had moved too fast to see, only the sound of the strikes giving him away. A few whispered that Daniel never raised his voice once, that his calm alone had been enough to undo half the gang before fists even flew. By mid-morning, Frank the veteran sat in his usual booth at the diner, his coffee steaming in front of him, his voice low as he told anyone who asked that Hannah herself had been the first to speak when silence threatened to swallow the room. He spoke with pride, not exaggeration, his weather hand steady as he repeated her words. She didn't need saving, she needed respect. People leaned closer to hear him, their heads nodding slowly, the weight of her defiance settling into the rhythm of the town. Deputy Reeves said little when pressed. His official report stripped down the lines of property damage and disturbance, his pen careful not to ink names that needed no embellishment. But in the gas station lot, in the post office queue, in the schoolyard as parents dropped their kids off, the story grew legs and ran. Folks who had once looked at the Cross brothers with suspicion or distance now spoke their names with reverence, their military service finally connecting with the quiet strength they carried home. The outlaws themselves were gone by dawn. Their bikes rumbled down the highway before the sun crested the trees, their bruised bodies hidden beneath leather, their pride too battered to stay. No one saw them again on county roads. Their absence was louder than their presence had ever been, the kind of silence that brought relief instead of fear. Murphy's bar reopened that evening. Its windows swept clean, the counters polished, though the locals who came in spoke in hushed tones, their eyes flicking to the spot near the jukebox where Bone Mercer had fallen. Hannah moved behind the counter with her usual steadiness, but this time every glass she poured, every plate she set down, was met with gratitude deeper than a tip could show. Men who had once looked away when trouble started now held her gaze and nodded with respect. The Cross name carried new weight in the county. It wasn't whispered in pity or with the old resentment of a family that had left for wars far away and returned changed. It was spoken as a promise, as a reminder. Trouble had come roaring on steel wheels, and trouble had been silenced. And long after the neon lights stopped buzzing and the broken glass was swept away, the town remembered not just the fight, not just the brothers, but the sister who had stood tall in its center, demanding the one thing that would outlast all of it: respect.